The school bell rang, its sharp clang echoing through the village. Children scattered, running toward their waiting parents, laughing and shouting as they burst out the gate. But there was no Adaise among them. Mama Ifeoma's heart leapt in her chest. She stood frozen at the gate, her eyes scanning the crowd, searching. But Adaise was not there. "Adaise!" she cried out, her voice breaking the air. She turned, her feet already moving, heart pounding as she raced toward the school. Inside the classroom, the air was thick with tension. The space was quiet, too quiet. Adaise's chair sat empty, but her school bag, untouched, was still on the desk. Her books and pencils lay scattered across the table, but the seat was cold, void of her presence. "Where is she?" Mama Ifeoma demanded as she burst through the classroom door. Her voice trembled with fear, but the teachers just shook their heads, looking away. "She left with the others," one of them muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Left with the others? Where is she now?" Mama Ifeoma's breath came out sharp, quick. Her eyes darted to each teacher, but they all refused to meet her gaze. She clenched her fists, but no answers came. Across the room, the headmaster's office door clicked shut. Mr. Okonkwo had disappeared, retreating into the shadows of his office without a word, leaving Mama Ifeoma standing alone in the classroom. She stared at the door, her fury rising like a storm. No one spoke. The silence grew thick, heavy with unease. Outside, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Villagers whispered in hushed tones. Mothers held their children tighter, fathers exchanged worried glances. The air was thick with fear, confusion spreading like wildfire. Then a voice called out. A child stood by Adaise's desk, holding something in their hand. "Look," they said, lifting a torn piece of paper. The paper fluttered in the air like a bird with broken wings. Mama Ifeoma stepped forward, her hands trembling as she snatched it from the child's fingers. She unfolded the note, her breath catching in her throat. She read aloud, her voice shaky. She saw something she wasn't meant to see. The crowd went silent. The words hung in the air, dark and ominous. "What does this mean?" someone asked. "Who wrote this?" Eyes turned to the teachers, but they remained silent, their faces hard as stone. A voice from the back of the crowd rose. "It's happened again." Ngozi's mother pushed her way forward, her face pale with grief. "My daughter vanished just like this last year. They took her, and now they've taken Adaise." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A chill swept over the villagers. They exchanged nervous glances, the whispers growing louder, darker. "What did she see? What is the school hiding?" someone whispered. A man standing near the door muttered, his voice low, "This school is cursed. The ancestors are warning us." The murmur spread through the crowd, reaching the farthest corners of the schoolyard. Fear gripped the villagers as the ancient curse of the school seemed to stir once again. The weight of the words felt heavier than the sun beating down from above. One by one, mothers pulled their daughters close, their faces twisted in fear. They turned and fled, vowing never to return. The schoolyard emptied, their footsteps leaving behind a silence that felt louder than any scream. But Mama Ifeoma did not move. She stood in the center of the crowd, her eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished. "I will not go home without Adaise," she muttered, her voice firm, unwavering. No one else remained. The mothers had gone, their voices lost in the wind. But Mama Ifeoma stood, resolute, as the sun began to set behind the school. Her daughter was out there, and she would not stop searching until she found her. The village had always been quiet in the mornings, the sun just starting to rise and the sounds of birds chirping filling the air. But this morning, Mama Ifeoma's mind was not quiet. She stood in front of her tiny home, tying her wrapper tightly around her waist. She moved with purpose, pouring palm oil into bottles with steady hands. Each drop felt like a promise, one she had made to herself and to her daughter. "Adaise must finish school," she whispered under her breath, her voice thick with determination. The words felt heavy, but she knew she would do anything to give Adaise the future she had never had. Adaise, 13 years old, was a bright and curious girl, with a sharp mind that never stopped asking questions. Her eyes sparkled with wonder at the world around her. She wasn't like other girls her age. Her thoughts went deeper, and her questions dug into places others didn't dare to ask. "Mummy, why don't boys fetch water too?" she had asked just the other day. The question was simple, but to Mama Ifeoma, it felt like a challenge to the world that had boxed them in. Mama Ifeoma smiled but didn't answer, lost in her thoughts. She had to keep her daughter safe. She had to see her succeed. The world would not give her that chance easily, but Mama Ifeoma would fight for it. She would make sure Adaeze went to school, no matter what the village thought. Mr. Okonkwo, the headmaster of the school, always smiled with kindness to parents, nodding his head and speaking of education with great passion. But behind that smile, behind those warm words, there was something else. Something that Mama Ifeoma had noticed in his eyes on more than one occasion. He would watch from his office window, his eyes sharp as though keeping track of something or someone. Was it just her imagination? She didn't know, but something about him never sat right with her. Then there was Ngozi's father. The pain on his face was clear to everyone who saw him. He had lost his daughter to the same school the year before. Ngozi had vanished, just like Adaeze, and no one had been able to explain why. He would shout in the market, his voice raw with grief. "My daughter vanished, and now another girl too? Do you think this is just a coincidence?" His eyes, full of fire, pierced through anyone who dared to speak against him. People had started to listen. What if there was something more to the disappearances? What if there was something the school was hiding? Whispers started spreading through the village. Should girls even be sent to school anymore? Mothers spoke in hushed tones, afraid of what might happen if they let their daughters continue their education. "They are safer at home," they would say, looking over their shoulders as if the wind might carry their words too far. But Mama Ifeoma could not turn back. Adaeze was bright, full of promise. She had to go far. Mama Ifeoma tied the wrapper tighter and whispered the vow to herself again. Adaeze must finish school. One day after school, Adaeze came home with an odd look on her face. Her mother had been busy, preparing for the market, but Adaeze's silence stopped her. "Mummy," she said slowly, "there's something strange in that storeroom." Mama Ifeoma had laughed it off. "You watch too many village plays," she had said, trying to brush away the unease that seemed to linger in her daughter's eyes. Now, Mama Ifeoma couldn't help but wonder. Had she brushed away something important? Had she missed a warning in Adaeze's words? It was only later that Mama Ifeoma learned what Adaeze had really seen. It had happened on one of those days when she was curious enough to peek through the half-open door of the school storeroom. What she had seen had left her speechless. Two teachers, one pushing the other hard, had fought violently. A red bag had fallen, spilling its contents onto the floor. Then, the teachers had frozen, their eyes locking onto Adaeze's. Their silence spoke volumes, and Adaeze had known, deep down, that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to. "Don't tell anyone what you saw," one of the teachers had warned her, though Adaeze was already too scared to speak. But later that evening, when she sat at her mother's feet, she couldn't help herself. "There's something strange in that storeroom, Mummy," she had said again. Mama Ifeoma had smiled and ruffled her hair. "You're imagining things, Adaeze. There's nothing strange there." But even then, her heart had been heavy. Now, that heavy feeling came back to her, stronger than ever. The storeroom had always been locked, and the children whispered that they sometimes heard strange sounds coming from inside. No one dared to ask about it. Behind the school, the grass never grew. There was always something off about that place, and the old teacher had warned, "Don't step behind that building." But no one ever asked why. Mama Ifeoma held Adaeze's last school uniform close to her chest, her heart heavy with regret. "She told me," she whispered, "and I didn't listen." Every time she thought of those words, she could feel the burn of shame in her chest. Had she ignored her daughter's warning? Had she let her curiosity lead her too far? One secret too many, one child too curious. What had Adaeze seen? What were they hiding in that school? And who was determined to keep it buried? Mama Ifeoma couldn't turn back now, not when there was so much at stake. Mama Ifeoma's heart was pounding like a drum as she stormed through the school gates, pushing past the gatekeeper with no regard for his protests. "Where is the storeroom my daughter saw?" she demanded, her voice thick with a mix of fear and rage. The school, the place she had trusted to give her daughter a future, had become a nightmare. The teachers, who had once seemed so friendly, now looked uneasy. One stammered, "That room has been locked for years. It's never used." The words felt like lies hanging in the air. The headmaster, Mr. Okonkwo, stood nearby, frowning deeply, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Something was wrong, very wrong. But before Mama Ifeoma could speak again, a quiet voice interrupted. It was Miss Amara, the young teacher who had always been kind to Adais. She pulled Mama Ifeoma aside, her face pale. "That room was never supposed to be opened," she whispered. "No one is supposed to go in there." The words chilled Mama Ifeoma to her core. The room was locked, yet the secret had been calling her. Adaize had seen something that had been hidden for far too long. More whispers began to swirl around the school. Girls had started talking about strange occurrences. "There are flickering lights behind the building," one girl whispered to another. "I heard crying, like someone was trapped." Another girl spoke of footsteps that had no shadow, moving across the yard in the dead of night. The stories were unsettling, and as they spread, more mothers began to speak out. One woman approached Mama Ifeoma, her voice shaking. "My daughter told me she saw a hand behind the storeroom." Her eyes were wide with fear. It was then that Ngozi's father, the man who had lost his daughter to this very school the year before, slammed his staff onto the ground, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "Enough is enough," he said, his voice firm and full of resolve. "Tonight, we go in." The crowd, once hesitant, now murmured in agreement. No more waiting, no more wondering. The time had come to confront whatever lay hidden behind the locked door. As night fell, the village gathered under the pale moonlight. With torches in hand and hearts full of courage, Mama Ifeoma and Ngozi's father led the group to the back of the school. The shadows were thick, but they moved forward, determined. The padlock on the storeroom door was old and rusty, but with a few determined pulls, it snapped. The door creaked open, its sound like the beginning of a terrible story. Dust and darkness poured out from the inside, but there was something more, something that made the air thicker, harder to breathe. As the door swung open, there was nothing inside at first. Empty shelves lined the walls, no sign of life. But then something caught Mama Ifeoma's eye. The floor. The wooden planks were slightly raised, and beneath them, something was hidden. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she lifted the planks, revealing a trapdoor beneath. The sight of it made her stomach turn. Bloodstains, fresh and dark, marked the edge of the trapdoor, dripping into the cracks of the floor. A low gasp escaped from the group as they stared at the ominous marks. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Then they found it, a school uniform, torn and bloodstained, hidden beneath the trapdoor. Mama Ifeoma's breath caught as she reached down and picked it up. "This is Adaize's," she cried out, holding the uniform to her chest as if she could make sense of the horror with just the touch of the fabric. But it made no sense. How could this be? The room was filled with gasps and cries. One parent fainted, and others scrambled to the door, terror rising in their eyes. Some stayed, shaking. "What is this place?" they whispered in horror. At that moment, Mr. Okonkwo appeared in the doorway, his face hard and unreadable. He surveyed the room, his eyes narrowing as if trying to control the chaos unfolding before him. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice steady, but his brow was slick with sweat. He tried to remain calm, but his face betrayed him. Ngozi's father was not fooled. He grabbed the headmaster by the shirt, his face twisted with rage. "Explain the blood, explain the door," he roared. "What did you do with our girls?" His grip tightened and the headmaster flinched, his composure slipping. Before Mr. Okonkwo could respond, Miss Amara appeared, her hands trembling as she pulled something from her bag. "I found this today," she said softly. It was Adaize's old notebook, the one she had kept hidden in her desk. She handed it to Mama Ifeoma, who opened it with shaking hands. The pages were filled with fear. Adaize had written about overhearing strange conversations, whispers between two teachers, words that made her blood run cold. "They said the girl child holds power," one entry read. "They need 3 more. The words were chilling, and the implications were even more terrifying. "Ritual?" one of the parents asked in a hoarse whisper. The word hung in the air like a curse, and the whole room seemed to freeze. Women began to cry, men shouted in disbelief. "Is this what our daughters are walking into every morning?" one man asked, his voice breaking. The chaos intensified. The teachers who had once seemed so trustworthy now turned on each other. 2 male teachers, their faces pale, began to argue vehemently. "You're lying," one accused, pointing a shaking finger at the other. "It's all your fault." The accusations flew, and one of the teachers tried to run, but the parents were too quick. They tackled him to the ground, pinning him as the others looked on in fear and confusion. But Mama Ifeoma's eyes were fixed on the trapdoor, the silence growing heavy around her. "What else is down there?" she asked, her voice low, but the question seemed to echo through the room. No one dared to answer. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the village, the parents stood in the schoolyard, their faces filled with anger and confusion. Some called the police, others called the elders. The tension in the air was thick, like the storm before a downpour. But Mama Ifeoma wasn't finished yet. She held Adaize's journal close to her chest, her eyes burning with resolve. "They thought our daughters were weak," she muttered. "They will see now. This is only the beginning." The war had begun. The village was divided, and the truth, long buried, was finally rising to the surface. The trapdoor was only the start. The fight for their daughters had just begun. The village square was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the distant call of birds as the elders gathered. The school gates, once a symbol of hope and progress, were now locked tight, a barrier between the truth and the people. The mothers clutched their daughters tightly, the weight of their protection heavy in the air. This was the moment of reckoning. This was where the truth would be laid bare. Mama Ifeoma stepped forward, her eyes burning with resolve. She pointed directly at Mr. Okonkwo, who stood at the front, his once strong demeanor now crumbling under the pressure. "Tell us the truth," she demanded, her voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "Where are our girls?" The crowd, a mix of parents, elders, and villagers, echoed her plea, their voices growing louder with each passing second. The air was thick with anticipation, but it was Miss Amara's sobs that broke the tension. She collapsed in front of the villagers, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her confession. I couldn't stay silent any longer," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "They lied to all of us. There is a secret cult inside this school." Gasps filled the air, and the villagers stepped back, their eyes wide with shock. Miss Amara wiped her eyes and continued, "They believe that girl children hold spiritual power. They need 3 to vanish to complete their ritual." A deep silence followed her words, one that stretched across the entire village. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. A secret cult? Rituals using their daughters? The crowd's disbelief turned to fury as parents turned to each other, eyes filled with horror. It was then that the memories of the previous year came rushing back. Ngozi's disappearance, the questions that had gone unanswered, the silence that had followed. It all clicked into place. The girls weren't just disappearing. They were being taken for something far darker. Mama Ifeoma felt a cold shiver run through her body as she thought of Adaize, her daughter, now lost to this nightmare. She turned to the villagers, her voice tight with determination. "We must go to the trapdoor," she said. "Whatever is beneath must be seen today." The villagers, led by the elders and parents, lit torches, their faces grim with purpose. The night had fallen, but this was no longer about darkness. It was about truth, and the truth had to be revealed. Elder Chike, an elder known for his wisdom, began to pray, his voice low but powerful, as they made their way to the back of the school. The trapdoor awaited them, the place where their daughters' fates had been sealed. When they opened it, the stench of damp earth and decay filled the air. Beneath them lay a hidden underground shrine, its walls covered in strange symbols and red markings. Candles flickered in the dark, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Names of girls who had vanished, were etched into the stone. A collective gasp filled the air as the villagers stepped inside, their torches illuminating the terrifying sight. A shrine stood in the center, surrounded by more candles. The air felt thick with an unnatural energy, as if the room itself was alive with dark power. The headmaster, Mr. Okonkwo, stood at the entrance, his face pale as he watched the villagers explore the underground room. He had no excuses left. The truth was undeniable. "I didn't plan it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I was warned. They said I'd lose my job if I interfered. I looked away. I'm sorry, but I never wanted this." Mama Ifeoma stepped forward, her face hard with anger. "And you let our daughters become sacrifices?" she shouted, her voice rising with fury. She hurled Adaize's journal at his feet. The pages fluttered, as though they, too, demanded answers. You knew? You knew and said nothing? The crowd surged forward, their anger now directed at him. But before they could speak further, a loud shout rang out from the school gates. "She's running!" someone cried. The villagers turned, and a figure sprinted down the path, her face twisted in fear. It was Teacher Uloma, Ngozi's aunt, the very person the villagers had never suspected. She had been part of the betrayal from the beginning. She clutched a sack tightly to her chest, as though trying to escape with the evidence of her crimes. But the villagers were faster. They surrounded her, and with a collective effort, she was dragged before the elders. Ngozi's father, his eyes wide with disbelief, snatched the sack from her hands. He opened it, and his face went ashen as he pulled out several charms and photos of the girls, including a photo of his own daughter. He roared, his voice filled with anguish. "You, my sister? My own blood did this?" The crowd was stunned, unable to comprehend the depth of the betrayal. Teacher Uloma, her face twisted in defiance, spat on the ground, her eyes burning with a cold, cruel fire. "You fools will never understand the power of daughters," she hissed. Her words sent a chill through the air. "You fear what you do not understand." The villagers stared at each other, the weight of the truth settling on them. The betrayal hadn't come from strangers. It had come from one of their own. One of their own had led the destruction of their children, all in the name of a twisted belief that no one understood. Miss Amara stepped forward, her eyes red from crying but filled with a determined clarity. "She told us we were protecting tradition," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "But it was all evil, hidden in the culture we were taught to uphold. This was not tradition. This was darkness." The elders nodded, their faces grim. Elder Chike stepped forward, his voice low but powerful. "This land must be cleansed," he declared, "and justice must speak louder than silence." Mama Ifeoma stepped to the front, her hands shaking as she held Adaize's journal aloft. "Let every mother read this," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "Let every ear hear. No more silence." The villagers stood tall, a renewed strength in their hearts. The school bell, once a symbol of knowledge and hope, had become a symbol of broken trust. The villagers moved to the bell, and with a single motion, they set it alight. The flames rose, eating away at the metal and the memories it held. "This place will never open again," the villagers chanted, their voices unified in their resolve. Mama Ifeoma turned to the crowd, her eyes filled with tears, but also with a fire that refused to be extinguished. "No child must ever walk into a classroom and never return," she cried, her voice trembling with grief and fury. The crowd echoed her words, a new cry rising in the air, "Protect the girls!" And with that, the village stood together, stronger than ever before. A new vow had been made. The girls would be protected. The darkness would never return. The distant sound of sirens cut through the heavy air as police trucks rumbled into the village, a stark reminder that the long-awaited reckoning had arrived. The villagers parted in silence, stepping aside to let the law take over. Uniformed officers filed out, their eyes scanning the crowd, focused on the task at hand. The time for secrets was over. The headmaster, Mr. Okonkwo, and the teachers who had been complicit in the horrors of the school were led away in chains. Their faces were void of expression, knowing that their betrayal had come to light. Uloma, the one who had orchestrated the sinister plot, remained eerily silent, her eyes staring into the distance. Her role in the twisted scheme had finally caught up to her. As the officers moved deeper into the shrine, the silence that had fallen over the crowd was broken by the piercing cries of discovery. 3 small bodies, wrapped in cloth, were found beneath the shrine. The village gasped in horror, the realization that their worst fears had come true. Ngozi's father, seeing his daughter's face among the bodies, fell to his knees, his grief too much to bear. The weight of the loss was felt by all, but the sense of justice that was beginning to take root gave some comfort to the villagers. Then a loud bang echoed from the back wall of the shrine. Police officers hurried to investigate, and with a few forceful blows, they pried open a small hidden chamber. Inside, curled in the corner, was a girl, Adaize. "Mummy!" Adaize screamed as her mother, Mama Ifeoma, rushed to her side. The two embraced, tears streaming down their faces. The crowd, stunned at the sight of Adaize alive, cheered. It was a moment of triumph amidst the pain. A girl who had once been thought lost forever had returned from the dead. Mama Ifeoma held Adaeze tightly, her voice shaky with relief. "You came back from the land of the dead," she whispered through her sobs. "The gods are kind." Miss Amara stood before the villagers, her voice steady, though filled with regret. "We failed our girls," she said, her eyes meeting the gaze of every mother in the crowd. "But I will not fail again. I will build a school for daughters, safe and strong. No child will ever walk in fear again." The village elders, having witnessed the horror and the courage of the villagers, declared that the school would be forever closed. Elder Chike, a man of wisdom, spoke with authority. "Let no child learn where blood once flowed," he said, and the villagers nodded in agreement. The school that had once been a place of learning and growth had now become a symbol of broken trust and loss. No one would ever step foot inside its crumbling walls again. Ngozi's father, his face marked with sorrow but a quiet sense of peace, lit a candle at the shrine. "She can rest now. They all can rest," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind that whispered through the trees. As the sun began to set, the women of the village gathered in Mama Ifeoma's compound. The time for grief was over. Now was the time for action. One mother stood and declared, "We will teach our girls. We will guard their futures." Plans were immediately set in motion for a new girls' learning center outside the village, one that would be a place of safety, hope, and strength. Chalkboards were donated, desks were built. Miss Amara worked day and night, ensuring that every detail was perfect. This school would not be like the one before. It would be a sanctuary, free from fear and darkness. The day of the grand opening arrived, and the girls marched proudly in their new uniforms, bright and full of hope. "No one will silence us again." Adaeze led the chant, her voice strong and unwavering. The villagers clapped and cheered, their hearts swelling with pride for the girls who had overcome so much. Police took Uloma away, her eyes still burning with defiance. "You can't kill the spirit," she spat, but no one listened anymore. Her words, once filled with power, now fell flat in the face of justice. At the new school, a wall of photos was hung. Pictures of Ngozi, Adaeze, and the other girls who had been taken, their faces forever etched in memory. Beneath each photograph, the words, "Never again," were written in bold, defiant letters. It was a pledge, a vow, to protect the girls, to never let such a tragedy happen again. Mama Ifeoma stood with Adaeze in front of the new school, her heart full of pride and love. "Books before fear," she said softly, looking into her daughter's eyes. "Knowledge before shame." Adaeze squeezed her hand, the bond between them stronger than ever before. The old school, the place that had once symbolized so much promise, now lay in ruins. No one touched it again. Grass slowly grew over its broken walls, a natural barrier to the pain and betrayal that had once taken place within. It was as if the land itself was reclaiming what had been lost, healing the wounds left by those who had been betrayed. A new song filled the air in the village the following morning. Children's laughter rang out, and mothers sang as they worked. The school bell rang once more, but this time, it was not a bell of fear or darkness. It was a bell of hope, of resilience, and of a new beginning. The village had risen from the ashes of tragedy, and the future, though hard-earned, now belonged to the children. Justice had been served. Adaeze had come back from the depths, and the villagers had fought for the future of their daughters. They would never forget the past, but they would not let it define them. A new chapter had begun, one where the voices of their daughters would ring loud and clear, where knowledge would be the light that guided them forward. And as the sun rose over the village, it was not just a new day. It was the dawn of a new era. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village, the voice of the ancestors seemed to echo through the rustling leaves of the great Iroko tree. A soft wind blew, carrying with it the weight of years, the lessons of the past, and the promise of a future shaped by wisdom. They said girls were weak, but it was a girl who saw the truth. The voice of the elder resonated through the gathering. Adaeze's bravery, her courage in the face of unimaginable terror, had shown that true strength often lies in the most unexpected places. They hid evil in a place of learning, but light found a way in. The words echoed like a prayer, as if to remind everyone that darkness, no matter how deeply buried, could never extinguish the light of truth and righteousness. Under the shade of the Iroko tree, where the villagers now gathered, elders, mothers, and children, the silence was heavy, but filled with reflection. It was Elder Chukwudi who broke it, his voice steady and firm as he lifted his staff, symbol of his wisdom. "We trusted blindly. We sent them in without asking who watches them," he said, his words heavy with regret. The truth that had unfolded had shaken the very core of their beliefs. "Let this be a warning to us all." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "Before you send your daughters to school, look deep. Ask hard questions. Trust, but never forget to question." Mama Efeoma, sitting beside her daughter, nodded slowly, her hand firmly holding Adaya's. "They called it tradition," she whispered, "but it was a trap." Adaya's, no longer the frightened girl she once was, now sat by the window, a new notebook before her. The sunlight bathed her face, highlighting the resolve in her eyes. As she wrote, her words were strong and clear. "I will become a teacher who protects." She underlined the word protects twice, her eyes burning with purpose. She had seen the darkness and emerged from it, and now she would spend her life ensuring no other girl would face the same fate. The village bell rang, but now it meant something entirely different. No longer did it signify the start of a day filled with fear. It rang for courage. It rang for resilience. It rang as a call to rise, not run. As the villagers looked on, the final words filled the air. Protect the girl child. Question every tradition. Evil hides in trusted places. Ask, watch, speak, always protect her. And with that, the village, its spirit unbroken, embraced a future where knowledge, trust, and protection would be the cornerstones of every child's life.